Hello, good afternoon, my subscriber, my viewers. That's right, you. I'm talking to you. Marine Sky, Crafty Sky Lady coming at you. And I think I have a somewhat interesting story to share. So I'm going to get right into it. Now, are many of you familiar with what happened on March 25th in 1911? The year 1911 in Greenwich, New York? Well, I'm going to share a story with you, and it's sad, but it really did happen. It's a part of our history, the country's history, New York's history, and I find it intriguing. This story kind of spoke to me, and so I'm gonna continue on and uh, tell it in my fashion. Okay, let's get started. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Now, why am I bringing this story to you? I mean, one can go to many different sources and read about it and that. But being a storyteller, and I have to have somewhat good content, and I have to have something that intrigues me or interests me or has some connection to different things or whatever I feel. So I am bringing this story. I had read it years ago, and it spoke to me then. Maybe it's because I'm a sewer, a crafter, a seamstress, so it just, the whole story just spoke to me, and so that's, and also that it happened in the month of March. Here we are, what, March 18th now, and happy belated St. Patty's Day to all of you. Story. So this happened. Now this factory was housed in the 8th and 9th and 10th floors of what they had called the, I believe it's the Ash building, ASCH building, but it is now known later the Brown building, which it was built in 1901 and remained standing on the New York University campus at 23 to 29 Washington Place near Washington Square Park. The building has been since designated as a national landmark and a New York City landmark, you can imagine. So it's one of the deadliest fires in history. 146 deaths of garment workers was noted. Greenwich is Manhattan, a borough of New York City. There was 123 women and 23 men that died in this fire. Many of the people, very young, were of Italian and Jewish immigrants with poorly educated and a very poor command of English. So you can just imagine that, you're in this factory with many other people, and you might not necessarily, you could have been working there for a couple of years and still don't know the person sitting to your left or your right because uh, you couldn't speak their language and they couldn't speak yours. The Italian couldn't speak to the Jewish immigrant and vice versa because there were those language barriers. And then a poor command of English didn't help matters any as well. So that was going on. Now, when I say young, I'm talking probably between the ages of 14 and 23, I think they said was the majority of the people working there. However, the oldest known victim was, I believe, a woman of 43 years old who they noted died of the smoke inhalations or jumping to her death or whatever, or a combination of all of that. Um, so at that time, it was also common practice for them to, in order for the workers to not sneak out or take unauthorized cigarette breaks or fresh air breaks or what have you, they would lock the doors to the factory so nobody could get out. Literally lock the doors. And this was their common practice. Can you imagine? So, and you can imagine how hot it was and everything in there with all those people and now it's a factory that made shirt waist blouses, shirts for women, and primarily white, I believe, too. Um, so um, if you go back to 1911 and you look at, the styles and the trends and how life was being lived and carried out on a day-to-day basis in New York, in Greenwich, in 1911, well, what was going on? Well, okay, the men were wearing tall hats and primarily suits, the little bow ties, and they were dressed in very nice suited attire. Most of the men that you'd see strolling the streets out and about were very much aware of their presentation, their attire, and primarily suits, even right down to your newspaper boy or um, a street vendor, selling something to you. They were still pretty dressed up compared to the way we go about our day here in 2026 and in New York City. And the women too. The women, what were they wearing? Where they were wearing beautiful hats with flowers and lots of adornment on these big hats. They might have been wearing some of their best jewelry. Definitely were in these shirtwaist, but very, blousey type of very crisp white, beautiful blouses and shirts with long skirts. Some of them might have been carrying a parasol, and they again were very much concerned and aware of their presentation, their attire as they strutted out and about on the streets in 1911 in the city or anywhere. Now, you have to remember that we're still at the horse and buggy days. There were trolleys and trains, but most of it was, you'll see a lot of still the horse and buggy throughout the city. And once in a while, one of those, what did I call it? Trundle seats or trundle seat type of automobiles, the very early ones. Yeah. So there's all of that. So just imagine, you're a young 14-year-old. That's my granddaughter's age. She's 13. My God. And working every day in these sweatshops and going to work, and you can't speak the language, and you can't speak, to your neighbors and that. You might have been a smoker. So, and it was also common practice, known that even though smoking was, banned, or not allowed in the factory itself, they were known to, the workers, to sneak a cigarette or two, being that there were so many people on one floor, one big room, that it would easily, you could probably get away with it, because I'm sure there weren't, enough eyes on you at that time, and cameras and that. So that what they would do is they would, smoke, and then they would blow the smoke, exhale into their skirts, into their apparel. And then they'd also, put the matches and the cigarette butts out, and then throw them into these bins. Now, these bins were, or something nearby. But what happened this particular day of the fire, it was about 4:40 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Um, they worked Monday through Friday, weekdays, 9-hour days. And then Saturdays, 7-hour days. So their only day off was Sunday. And you can just imagine, a young girl, barely 14, working in these sweatshops, or even, up to the 23 age. I mean, young women, uneducated, um, not speaking good English at all, not understanding the language of others around them, all pretty much immigrants. And it's a Saturday afternoon. The place is just about closing down. And it was kind of your typical March day, kind of a daunting day, not kind of gloomy out, I guess. And so at 4:40, a fire breaks out on, see, what floor was it? I think it was the 8th floor. Let's see if I can find it. Uh, a fire flared up in the scrap bin on the 8th floor. I was right. Okay, the 8th floor, on the northeast corner of the 8th floor. Now, mind you, again, these doors are locked. And the first alarm was sent at 4:45 p.m. by a passerby on Washington Place who saw smoke coming from the 8th floor. Now, both owners of this factory were present that day, and actually had invited their own kids there. I don't know how many, and they don't talk more about what happened with the kids. They must have gotten out with their parents, because once the fire did break out, and like I said, they're believing that it they had concluded, the fire marshal and everything concluded that the fire broke out in one of those scrap bins of fabric from the on a cutter's table. Now, those bins where the cutters were, imagine they were probably quickly cutting these things. I'm sure they were on a time frame, and on a quota, getting those pieces done, and to the next level of, the sewers or whatever. So these scraps built up for over a 2-month span. So you've got a bin, and it's probably a wooden bin of, or maybe a fabric sewn type bin, but it's, a big, good sized bin under the table where all these scraps kept getting thrown, and they didn't get cleaned out for more than 2 months at a time. So they concluded that it was a match or a cigarette butt that didn't get put out properly, maybe one that was, being snuck by one of the cutters. And that's what started, and things ignited fast because the only thing that was not highly flammable were they're calling the steel something or other, but I can't imagine that they're talking about steel on the garments. I mean, would the buttons have been still? That part's still puzzling to me, but they talk about the steel was the only thing that wasn't highly flammable, although it would get hot. But highly now the sewing machines had to have been, made of steel. So maybe they're talking about the equipment. I'm not sure about that one, but you can imagine that everything else was pretty, and the fabric that was hanging above, whether it was finished shirts or a fabric to be grabbed to get the next cut. I don't know, but you can imagine that things were flaring up fast, and this fire took off fast. And so what happened too was the owners, and their names was Max. Got this. Mm, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. Uh, okay, so let me. And they, two, actually, they were Jewish immigrants themselves. Uh, yeah, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, both Jewish immigrants who survived the fire by fleeing to the building's roof when it began. Uh, and I'll get to the other part of it. But anyway, okay. Uh, yeah, the cutters were known to sneak cigarettes, exhaling the smoke through their lapels to avoid detection. A New York Times article suggested that the fire had been started by the engines running in sewing machines. But the fire marshal, uh, and also an insurance monitor, a leading industry journal at that time, observed that the shirtwaist had recently fallen out of fashion. So there was a lot of, like we're doing right now with the, you know, head news, like the Savannah Guthrie story and all that. We're coming up with our own theories. So there's a lot of, um, rumors and theories being, spoken about, and sign of the times. So this one leading industry journal observed that the shirtwaists were going out of style. So maybe someone maybe purposely started the fire or whatever. And then there's also, like I said, arson among certain sectors of the garment industry. Whenever their particular product fell out of fashion or had excess inventory in order to collect insurance. So there was a lot of theories going out and about as to what caused the fire, but it was the fire marshal at that time who concluded that it started in a scrap bin, probably from a match or the cigarette butt. hmm Although Blank and Harris, the two owners, were known for having had four previous suspicious fire claims, arson was not suspected in this case. A bookkeeper on the eighth floor was able to warn employees on the 10th floor via telephone, but there was no audible alarm and no way to contact staff on the 9th floor. Can you imagine? According to survivor Yetta Lubitz, the first warning of the fire on the 9th floor arrived the same time as the fire itself. Although the floor had a number of exits, including 2 freight elevators, a fire escape, and stairways down to Green Street and Washington Place, flames prevented workers from descending the Green Street stairway, and the door to the Washington Place stairway was locked to prevent theft. Oh, that's another thing. They also were feared of theft by the workers. The locked doors allowed managers to check the woman's purses. Also, maybe they were worried that these people were taking things. Wow. Various historians also have further ascribed the locked doors to management's wanting to keep out union organizers. Unions were starting to build back then and becoming a trending thing. Wanted to keep out union organizers for anti-union bias. The foreman who held the stairway door key had already escaped by another route. Dozens of employees escaped the fire by going up the Green Street stairway to the roof. They had over 500 employees. I don't know if I noted that earlier, in the whole factory as a whole. Yeah. By going up the fire, escaped the fire by going up the Green Street stairway to the roof. Other survivors were able to jam themselves into the elevators for as long as they could continue to operate. Within 3 minutes of the fire starting, the Green Street stairway became unusable in both directions. Terrified employees crowded onto the single exterior fire escape, which city officials had allowed ash to erect instead of the required third staircase. The fire escape was flimsy and poorly anchored, you can imagine. Iron structure that may have already been broken before the fire. It soon twisted and collapsed from the heat and overload, spilling about 20 victims nearly 100 feet to their deaths on the concrete pavement below. The remainder of the victims jumped to their death to escape the fire or were eventually overcome by smoke and flames. The fire department arrived quickly, but but able to stop the flames. Their horse-drawn ladders reached nearly as high as the 7th floor. The fallen bodies breaks my heart. The fallen bodies and jumping victims prevented the approach of the fire department staff to the building. Elevator operators Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortellaro saved many lives by traveling 3 times up to the ninth floor for passengers, but more to Lara was eventually forced to give up when the rails of his elevator blocked under the heat. Some victims pried the elevator doors open and jumped into the empty shaft, trying to slide down the cables or to land on top of the car. The weight and impacts of these bodies warped the elevator car and made it impossible for Zito to make another attempt. Oh my goodness. So horrible. And so body on a stone sidewalk. A large crowd of bystanders gathered on the street, witnessing 62 people jumping or falling to their deaths from the burning building. Lewis Waldman, later a New York socialist state assemblyman, described the scene years later. One Saturday afternoon in March of that year, March 25 to be precise, I was sitting at one of the reading tables in the old Astor Library. It was a raw, unpleasant day, and the comfortable reading room seemed a delightful place to spend the remaining few hours until the library closed. I was deeply engrossed in my book when I became aware of fire engines racing past the building. By this time, I was sufficiently Americanized to be fascinated by the sound of fire engines. Along with several others in the library, she ran out to see what was happening and followed crowds of people to the scene of the fire. A few blocks away, the Ash Building at the corner of Washington Place and Green Street was ablaze. When we arrived at the scene, the police had thrown up a cordon around the area and the firemen were helplessly fighting the blaze. Again, horse and buggy. The 8th, ninth, and 10th stories of the building were now an enormous, roaring cornice of flames. Word had spread through the East Side by some magic of terror that the plant of the Triangle Waste Company was on fire and that several hundred workers were trapped. Horrified and helpless, the crowds, I among them, this lady, looked up at the burning building, saw girl after girl appear at the reddened windows. Pause for a terrified moment, and then leap to the pavement below to land as mangled, bloody pulp. Imagine that. Think about that, folks. We can't forget what these people went through. This went on for what seemed like a ghastly eternity. Occasionally, a girl who had hesitated too long was licked by pursuing flames and, screaming, with clothing and hair ablaze, plunged like a living torch to the street. Life nets held by the firemen were torn by the impact of the falling body. Another picture of horses draped in black. Oh, this is in memory. This is afterward. How awful. The aftermath. Although early estimates of the death toll ranged from 141 to 148, almost all later references agree that 146 people died as a result of the fire. Again, 123 women and girls and 23 men. Of the victims whose ages are known, the oldest victim was 43 years old, a 43-year-old Providenza Pano. And the youngest were 14-year-olds, Kate Leone and Rosaria Sarah Maltese. Most victims died of burns, asphyxiation, blunt impact injuries, or a combination of all three. The first person to jump was a man. Another man was seen kissing a young woman at a window before they both jumped to their death. Bodies of the victims were taken to Charities Pier, also called Misery Lane, located at 26th Street and the East River for identification by friends and relatives. Victims were interred in 16 different cemeteries. 22 victims of the fire were buried by the Hebrew Free Burial Association in a special section at Mount Richmond Cemetery. In some instances, their tombstones refer to the fire. 6 victims remain unidentified until 2011 when Michael Hirsch, a historian, completed 4 years of researching newspaper articles and other sources for missing persons and was able to identify each of them by name. Wow, that's great. Those 6 victims were buried together in the cemetery of the Evergreens in Brooklyn. Originally interred elsewhere on the grounds, their remains now lie beneath a monument to the tragedy, a large marble slab featuring a kneeling woman. Wow. Oh, and so then there was consequences. Okay, let's go here. This is a little interesting too. So the consequences, the company's owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, both Jewish immigrants who survived the fire by fleeing up to the building's roof when it began, were indicted on charges of first and second degree manslaughter in mid-April of 1911. The pair's trial began on December 4th, 1911. Max Stewart, counsel for the defendants, managed to destroy the credibility of one of the survivors, Kate Alterman, by asking her to repeat her testimony a number of times, at which she did without altering her key phrases. Stewart argued to the jury that Alterman and possibly other witnesses had memorized their testimony, their statements, and might even have been told what to say by the prosecutors. The prosecution charged that the owners knew that the exit doors were locked at the time in question. The investigation found that the locks were intended to be locked during working hours based on the findings from the fire, but the defense stressed that the prosecution failed to prove that the owners knew that. The jury acquitted the 2 men of first and second degree manslaughter, but they were found liable of wrongful death during a subsequent civil suit in 1913, in which plaintiffs were awarded compensation in the amount of $75 per deceased victim. The insurance company paid Blanc and Harris $64,925 more than the reported losses, or about $445 per casualty. Roche, we have tried, you good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. We have tried, you citizens. Anyhow, it goes on, but yeah, what a sad, sad thing to have taken place. How horrible. I guess, my ancestry takes me to New York, the Mount Vernon area of New York. My dad, family lived. He he was born in Mount Vernon, New York, and story goes that his grandparents owned and operated a little like general store. Yeah, and then they navigated out this way to the Turner's Falls area, called the Patch, just over the mountain where I go to all the time for my pharmacy, which is right near that whole area. Because the story goes that there were to be jobs, and actually it was going to be big, like the city, like New York, because they started out with, numbering the streets: First Street, Second Street, Third Street, Avenue A. That it was to be a bigger city than it's just a small village town. It never manifested, but that was the actual intent when it was, discovered, let's say. But I wanted to also stress that I too lived through a fire, much different though. I mean, nobody got hurt or anything, but the fire was, I was about 10 or 11 and years old, and we, the youngest of four, and pulled up the trail. And so Route 2, Mohawk Trail, and our little restaurant was more of a pizza and beer type of restaurant. You could get a sandwich, a hamburger, and something like that, a little ham sandwich or something. But mostly pizzas and beer were what we were noted for. And we were popular to the area people. And there was also apple orchards all around there. So we got a lot of business from the apple pickers and people that, frequented the area on a daily basis. And so there was a fire that broke out in the initial building that my parents, you know, bought back it was in the mid 60s. And so, let's see, I was born in 53, so 63, I was 10. So, right around 1964. Yeah. And so, we, I'll never forget it. So everything pretty well burned to the ground, but the only thing remaining was the huge stone fire for a few seconds, and just, let myself, reminisce of some of the good times and I remember a fond memory of my father and mother purchased a stereo cabinet. Back then in the 60s, they were famous for having your stereo in a big cabinet unit, furniture piece, heavy, probably on legs. And so the record player, you open up the top lid, and the record player was down inside the unit. And I remember the first record album they played on that was Moon River by Andy Williams, a pretty song. Look that one up if you're not familiar with it. But anyway, yeah, so the fire broke out. It had started with some electrical in the back, and that's another whole story that someday I'll tell that story. But anyway, as a kid, seeing those horrific flames, and it was at night, and how we learned about it was that somebody saw the flames in the restaurant and parked their car in front of our house because the house and the restaurant was a good football field distance. And so, my sister and I shared a bedroom and we're all asleep, and you could hear our bedroom was closest to the road, and you could hear, it was summertime, and you could hear, or early fall, you could hear, hey, hey, wake up, your place is on fire. And yeah. And so another memory from the fire is that us kids got to, my parents had a big jar of pennies behind the bar. I'm talking a big, like, pickle jar or whatever, full of pennies. And evidently that exploded in the fire with the heat and the flames, or melted or whatever. But anyway, those pennies were charred and they were all over the floor near the bar. So us kids got to go in there and kind of pick up all those charred pennies. I remember that was kind of fun. They let us do that. But anyway, nobody got hurt and everything. But um, really seeing the restaurant burn and those huge, you know, flames just roaring away, as a kid, 10, 11 years old, that was quite traumatic. And, I remember, as a kid seeing that, my sister and I grabbed our pillowcases and grabbed anything that was valuable to us. We didn't have much, but, I can remember things like, your little jewelry box or something. I mean, I stuffed it in thinking that the fire's going to come through the woods and, come to the house kind of thing. But anyway, yeah, I lived through a fire. So this story kind of spoke to me, being a seamstress, and um, also, one for women's rights, and also one for, good working conditions and all that. And that it just, and what they went through. And like I said, having a little history going back to the city from on my father's side. So that's what led me to want to do a story about this incident, because I'm sure a lot of people, we go through our lives, but we don't know the history, don't know a lot of history, and there's so much to talk about, or and we need to give prayer once in a while to those people who came before us and endured such horrific things. And there certainly is a strong, and I hope you like it, and I hope that you're doing well and your day is unfolding exactly as you wish it to. And I'm gonna go, and until we meet again. Oh, one more thing. I do have my microphone, and I hope it's all working accordingly. It looks like it is. The green light's on, so let's hope, right? But my sister, who's gone, she's been passed away at age 49. I'm 73, and I'm the youngest, so she was a year older than me. So you can imagine how many years she's been gone. But she bought me this. I thought it was a fitting little tribute to all who passed and everything. Let's say a prayer for those people. Remember them in prayer. How awful, that terrible thing they endured. Can't forget, folks. Okay. Buttons and bows. Buttons and bows. Bye-bye.